Good evening. I am the historian, keeper of forgotten crafts. Tonight, the art of crafting fountain pen nibs, tiny pieces of metal that transformed writing from a chore into an art. Before the ballpoint pen, before typewriters became common in every office, there was the fountain pen. And at the heart of every fountain pen was the nib, that small, split piece of metal that touched the page. Creating a good nib was an art that took years to master, a craft that combined metallurgy, engineering, and an almost intuitive understanding of how metal and ink and paper interact. In Birmingham, England, during the late 1800s, nib-making was a specialized trade employing thousands of workers. The city's jewelry quarter was filled with small workshops where craftsmen bent over benches, shaping tiny pieces of metal into writing instruments. The work was exacting, repetitive, and required skills that could only be learned through years of apprenticeship. The process began with sheets of steel or gold alloy, carefully selected for their specific properties. Steel nibs were for everyday use since the metal made them affordable and extremely durable. Gold nibs were for the wealthy, prized not just for their prestige, but for their superior flexibility and corrosion resistance. The metal had to be hard enough to hold its shape under the pressure of writing, yet flexible enough to respond to the subtle variations in the writer's hand, creating the thick and thin lines that gave character to penmanship. The nib maker would begin by cutting the basic shape using a press, a die that stamped out the rounded point with shoulders that would fit into the pen holder. These blanks emerged from the press dozens at a time, but they were far from finished. Each one required individual attention, individual craftsmanship, to transform it from a stamped piece of metal into something that could write. The split down the center of the nib, that thin channel that allows ink to flow from the reservoir to the paper, had to be cut by hand using a specialized blade. This was one of the most critical steps. The channel had to be precisely the right width. Too wide, and ink would flood onto the page in an unusable blob. Too narrow, and the pen would scratch and skip, the ink unable to flow smoothly. The cutter would make this split in a single confident motion, feeling the resistance of the metal, knowing from experience exactly how much pressure to apply. Then came the grinding, shaping the tip to the perfect angle, creating the point where metal would meet paper thousands upon thousands of times. Master nib makers used grinding wheels with progressively finer abrasives, moving from rough shaping to fine smoothing. They could feel the difference of a fraction of a millimeter. The angle had to be exactly right. Too steep, and the nib would dig into the paper. Too shallow, and it would skip across the surface without proper contact. They would test each nib repeatedly, writing figure eights on sample paper, feeling for any roughness, any hesitation in the flow. A good nib should glide across paper with almost no resistance, the ink flowing steadily from the internal channel, the metal flexing slightly with each stroke to create variation in line width. If there was any catch, any scratchiness, back to the grinding wheel it went. The tipping was perhaps the most delicate work of all, for nibs meant to last, nibs that would write hundreds of thousands of words over years of use. A tiny ball of harder metal had to be applied to the very tip. Iridium was the metal of choice, an element so hard it could take the wear of constant writing without degrading. But iridium is also difficult to work with, requiring high temperatures and perfect timing. The nib maker would heat a tiny ball of iridium, barely visible to the naked eye, until it was just at the point of melting, then touch it to the prepared nib tip. The two metals had to bond completely, becoming one piece, with no gap or weakness where they joined. The heat had to be precisely controlled, hot enough to create a permanent bond, not so hot that it damaged the nib's carefully achieved temper and flexibility a moment too long at high heat, and the nib would become brittle. A moment too short, and the tipping would eventually work loose. After tipping came more grinding, this time working with the iridium itself, shaping it into a smooth point. Iridium is harder than steel, harder than gold, which made it excellent for durability, but challenging to shape. The grinder had to work slowly, patiently, with diamond dust wheels, gradually bringing the tipped nib to its final form. Then, the polishing. Hours of work with progressively finer compounds until the nib gleamed, until it felt like silk against paper, until there was no texture at all, just smooth metal that would glide effortlessly across the page. The polisher would test the nib at different angles, writing in different directions, ensuring that whether you pushed or pulled the pen, whether you bore down or wrote lightly, the experience was consistent. Finally came the finishing touches. Some nibs received decorative engraving, patterns, flourishes, the maker's mark. Others were left plain, their beauty in their function rather than ornamentation. Each nib was individually inspected, tested one final time, and then carefully packaged for sale. The craft required an understanding that something so small could matter so much. A writer might use the same pen for decades, and the nib would gradually conform to their particular style, their pressure, their rhythms. The iridium would wear in a pattern unique to that writer's hand. Each nib became individual, shaped by years of use, until it wrote perfectly for its owner and awkwardly for anyone else. There were specialists within the trade too. Some makers focused on flexible nibs for ornamental writing, nibs that could create dramatic variations in line width with changes in pressure. Others made stub nibs for italic hands, or extra fine nibs for detailed work, or broad nibs for bold strokes. Each type required different skills, different understanding of how the metal would behave under different uses. When ballpoint pens arrived in the 1940s and 1950s, nib-making largely vanished as a trade. The ballpoint was convenient, reliable, required no ink bottles or blotting paper. It wrote upside down, wrote in zero gravity, wrote on almost any surface. But it also wrote the same way every time. No variation in line, no response to the writer's touch, no personality in the marks it made. A few artisans still practice the craft today, usually creating custom nibs for collectors and enthusiasts. But the great workshops of Birmingham are gone, converted to other uses or torn down entirely. The knowledge of how steel should feel under the grinder, how iridium should bond at precisely the right temperature, how a perfect channel should flow, that knowledge lives now mostly in the remaining pens themselves, and in the memories of the few who still remember when writing was as much about the tool as the words. Thank you for joining me in the Sleepkeeper's Library. If you enjoyed this story, I hope you'll join me here again soon among the archives of forgotten crafts. Good night.